The house was warm, filled with the usual Thanksgiving cheer. The scent of roasting turkey, the low murmur of conversation, the sound of my mother clinking her glass in a signal for attention. It was supposed to be a celebration, a family affair. The table was set perfectly, the silverware gleaming, the flowers in the centerpiece arranged just so. It had always been this way, a flawless picture of family life. But there was one thing missing in the frame, me. I knew the role I played in this family. I had known it for years. I was the quiet one, the background character, the one who had learned to make herself small. Catherine, my older sister, was always the shining star. She was the one who got the compliments, the applause, the recognition. And I existed in the spaces between her spotlight, quietly waiting for a glance, a word, any acknowledgement that I was part of this family too. That Thanksgiving, I thought maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. But deep down, I knew better. My family had a habit of making me feel invisible. It was an art form they had perfected over the years. My mother, Carolyn, was always so proud of Catherine, her accomplishments, her smile, her life. Catherine's wedding had been the highlight of the year. My mother had talked about it endlessly, showing off every picture, recounting every detail as though the world had stopped spinning just to admire my sister. And I had smiled politely, nodded, and endured. But on this particular evening, something inside me began to crack. The words were simple, but they felt like a slap. "So, Eliza," my mother said, her voice rising above the hum of conversation. Her gaze flickered over to me and then back to Catherine. "When's your wedding? When can we expect the big day? Are we going to have a big celebration like Catherine had?" For a split second, the world stopped. I could feel my heart beat loudly in my chest, but I didn't say anything. I couldn't. The room had gone eerily silent, as if the very air around us had thickened and started to suffocate me. Catherine didn't look up, her face fixed in a mask of perfect composure. I could see her fingers tighten around her glass. She knew what was coming. We all did. I didn't say anything at first. I couldn't. How could I respond to that question, knowing that the answer would be nothing but a reminder of the decades of silence, of absence, of not being enough? My parents had always made sure that Catherine was the center of everything, her achievements, her beauty, her wedding, always perfect. And then there was me, invisible. I stared at my plate, pushing the food around with my fork. I didn't want to look at anyone, but I could feel the weight of their stares, the eyes on me. My mother's eyes glistening with that forced smile, the one she always wore when she wanted to play the part of the concerned, doting mother. My father, David, pretending not to hear, carving the turkey as if the dinner were more important than the tension thickening in the air. Catherine, sitting across from me, still the golden child, the one everyone adored. The one everyone expected to be perfect, even when she was. I had learned to play my part in this family, to keep quiet, to step aside. It was my role, and as much as it hurt, I had accepted it. But now, sitting at this table, hearing my mother ask me that question, something snapped. I set my fork down gently, my hands trembling slightly, and said, "I already had mine." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. For a brief moment, I thought no one would hear me. But then, David whispered from across the table, his voice barely audible. "We never got them." The room seemed to freeze. I could feel my pulse racing. My throat felt tight, my chest ached. For a moment, I didn't know if I could breathe. I hadn't expected this. Not here, not in front of everyone. And yet there it was, the truth, as sharp as glass, shattering the illusion they had built. I reached into my bag slowly, every movement deliberate. My fingers brushed against the smooth leather of my phone, and I pulled it out, tapping the screen with a calmness that felt so foreign. I wasn't sure what I was going to do yet, but I knew I had to do something. I opened the email logs, the tracking receipts I'd saved in my inbox, the proof that I'd sent the invitations months ago. Catherine's name was on the signature line of each of the packages. She had received them, all of them. She had opened them. She had chosen not to tell anyone, chosen not to show anyone. The truth started to sink in, and with it came the familiar feeling of betrayal. The knot in my stomach grew tighter, heavier. I turned the phone around, not rushing, not making it dramatic, just steady. "You got invitations," I said softly, watching as my family processed the words. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that speaks louder than any argument. My mother's smile faltered. David blinked, confusion and guilt flashing across his face. But Catherine didn't flinch. She didn't do anything. Her face remained perfectly still, her eyes fixed on her plate. I didn't wait for them to respond. I had no intention of defending myself. I had no intention of explaining. The damage had already been done. "What do you mean?" David asked cautiously, his voice quieter now. "You never sent invitations." I shook my head, my hands still steady, still in control. "No," I said. "You received them, they were delivered, you just didn't want to see them." It was no use trying to reason with them. They had built this perfect image of the family they wanted to show the world. And I was nothing but a footnote, a ghost that didn't fit into their narrative. And for the first time, I realized I didn't want to be part of their story anymore. ChatGPT said, "Certainly, here's Chapter 2. Chapter 2, The Unspoken Truth." The rest of Thanksgiving dinner passed in a blur. I don't remember much of what was said after I placed my phone on the table. I don't remember what anyone ate, or the clink of silverware, or the background noise of laughter and chatter. It all became muffled, as if the world was happening behind a pane of glass, and I was stuck on the other side, staring in. My father didn't say anything more, not for the rest of the evening. He just sat there, staring at me with a strange mixture of confusion and regret. His eyes, which had always seemed so warm, were now distant, like he didn't know who I was anymore. My mother, too, sat frozen, her hand still pressed to her mouth as if she were trying to stifle a scream. But no one screamed. Not yet. Not at that moment. And Catherine, she didn't flinch, didn't say a word. She just kept her eyes on her plate, her jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might break. She didn't even try to defend herself, to make an excuse. She didn't have to. We both knew the truth now. The truth had been laid bare, and it was too late to hide it. I stood up quietly, not waiting for anyone to speak, and excused myself from the table. The air felt different now, heavier somehow. I could still hear the soft murmur of the family behind me, but it all felt far away, like I was in a different world altogether. As I walked down the hallway to the guest room, the sound of my own footsteps was deafening in the silence. I didn't know what to do next. I didn't know if I should stay or leave or just disappear altogether. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to pretend anymore. I found myself standing by the window, looking out at the empty street. The cold air outside seemed inviting. Like the world out there was quieter than the one I had just left behind. But inside, I felt like I was unraveling, bit by bit. The feeling of being invisible, of never being truly seen, had followed me for years. But it was in that moment that I realized just how much I had internalized it. I had spent so many years shrinking myself, letting my family treat me like an afterthought. And now, after everything, it was all too much. I glanced over at the bed, where the invitation cards I had so carefully designed and sent sat untouched on the desk. Catherine's name on the envelope, the signature she'd so deliberately hidden. I could still feel the sting of it in my chest, a sharp, cold ache that wouldn't go away. She had done this. She had taken something that was mine, something I had worked for, and crushed it without a second thought. But what hurt the most wasn't the fact that my wedding had been sabotaged. It was the realization that Catherine had always been able to take everything from me and never look back. Every milestone I achieved, every small victory I had, was overshadowed by her. I had spent so many years trying to get her attention, trying to prove that I mattered, that I was worth something. But no matter what I did, I was never enough. I sat on the bed, feeling the weight of everything. The years of silence. The years of being passed over, ignored, dismissed. It was all crashing down on me all at once. I had never allowed myself to truly feel the depth of it, but now, with the truth finally in the open, it was impossible to ignore. Then I heard a knock at the door. It was Ethan. I opened the door and he stepped inside without a word, his eyes searching mine. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He could see it in the way I was standing, in the way my shoulders sagged with exhaustion. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. I nodded, though the words felt hollow in my mouth. "I think I am," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "but I'm not sure who I am anymore." Ethan stepped closer, wrapping his arms around me without hesitation. His embrace was warm, solid, and for the first time in hours, I felt like I could breathe again. "You don't have to carry this alone," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "You never have to." I held on to him tightly, feeling the tears prickling at the back of my eyes. I hadn't realized how much I had needed to hear those words, how much I had needed someone to finally see me, not as the afterthought, not as the person everyone forgot, but as me. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice shaking. We stayed like that for a long time, in the quiet of the room, letting the weight of the evening settle. It wasn't a happy moment, not by any means, but it was the first time in a long time that I felt like I wasn't invisible. It was the first time I allowed myself to feel seen. And as I held him, I knew that things were about to change. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that I didn't care about the years of betrayal and neglect. The truth was out now, and though it felt like a storm was coming, I was ready for it. For the first time, I was ready to face whatever came next. The heavy silence at the dinner table was a weight I could feel in my chest. It pressed down on me, suffocating, as if it knew what was about to happen. Thanksgiving had always been a family affair, a time for laughter, warmth, and the usual fake smiles that everyone wore like a uniform. But this year, it felt different. The absence of sincerity hung in the air, thicker than the smell of turkey. I sat there, my fork halfway to my mouth, trying to keep the tears from rising. The chatter around me had died down when my mother raised her glass, her smile too bright. She tapped it lightly, drawing everyone's attention. It was the same routine every year. She wanted the spotlight, even if it meant taking it from me. "Catherine's wedding was absolutely wonderful," she said, her voice laced with pride. "So, Eliza, when's yours? When are we going to have something to celebrate?" The room went still. My father, who had been carving the turkey with robotic precision, looked up for the first time, but only to glance at my mother. He said nothing. He never did. But it was the way my sister, Catherine, smiled to herself, her eyes not meeting mine, that made the air turn cold. I set my fork down carefully, trying to steady my hand. My voice, though, was calm, eerily calm. "I already had mine," I said, glancing at my mother, then at my father. The silence that followed was deafening. You could feel the collective breath of the room catch in their throats. No one knew what to say. My mother's smile faltered for a split second before she quickly tried to mask it with her usual, practiced cheer. "What do you mean, you already had yours?" she asked, her voice high-pitched in a way that suggested she hadn't fully processed what I said. "6 months ago," I replied, my eyes meeting hers steadily. I could see her searching for the right words, trying to grasp the situation, but it was too late. The truth had been set free, and it would not be denied. "You got invitations," I added, my voice unwavering. There it was, the truth that had been buried beneath the surface for so long. The thing that they'd all worked so hard to ignore, to pretend didn't exist. My mother's face paled. I watched her swallow, eyes darting around the table, but no one spoke. No one dared to. Not even Catherine, who had been the center of attention for years, seemed to have anything to say. "That's ridiculous," my mother finally muttered, but the words didn't have the same conviction as before. They were a defense mechanism, something she always said when faced with something she couldn't control. "I think you need to look at this," I said, pulling out my phone slowly, ensuring every eye was on me. I scrolled through the messages, the receipts, the tracking logs. 4 invitations sent, 4 signatures received, all marked as delivered. The phone screen glowed in the soft candlelight, and the faces around the table grew even more tense. Catherine looked down at her plate, her fingers nervously twisting the napkin. My father's gaze moved from the screen to me, and then to my sister. There was no more denial. There was only the quiet realization that my wedding had been erased from their minds, on purpose. You never got them?" I asked, directing the question to my father, though I already knew the answer. He shook his head slowly. "No, we never got them." I let the silence sit between us for a long moment, watching my family squirm under the weight of their own guilt. It was the same game they'd always played, ignore, deny, pretend, and I had always played along, but not this time. I don't think it was a mistake, I said softly, my voice sharp. I think someone made sure you didn't see them. Someone didn't want you to see me. Catherine didn't meet my eyes. She never did. It was as though she could feel the wall I was putting up between us, and she was terrified it would shatter her carefully constructed world. I didn't mean to, Catherine began, her voice small and defensive. But there was no excuse that would make the situation better, no apology that could undo the hurt. Lily, my father whispered, his voice shaking as he realized the truth. You did this. Catherine's face turned bright red. She had nothing to say, no words to defend herself. She just sat there, staring at her lap, the weight of her actions finally catching up to her. It wasn't just about the invitations anymore. It was everything. It was the years of silence, the years of watching her get everything while I got nothing. The way my achievements were overlooked, my happiness ignored. Catherine had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, while I was always in the background, always second. And for what? Because I had the nerve to marry someone I loved quietly without making a spectacle of it. You've always been the center of attention, I said, my voice growing steadier. But not this time. This time I'm not going to hide in your shadow anymore. Catherine finally looked at me, her face pale and shocked. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came. There was no excuse for what she'd done. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. I'm done. I'm done pretending that you see me, done pretending that this family was ever fair. I looked at my mother one last time, her eyes wide with disbelief, her lips trembling. You didn't miss my wedding, Mom. You chose not to see it. And with that, I walked out of the room, leaving the silence to fill the space they had created. The silence that was finally mine to own. The drive back from my parents' house was agonizingly quiet. I could feel the tension still hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. Every time I glanced at Ethan, he just kept his eyes on the road, his expression unreadable. I knew he wanted to say something, anything, but he didn't. We were both trapped in the weight of my words, in the way the truth had shattered everything. For the first time in my life, I was no longer afraid to speak it. When we finally got home, the house felt foreign. Even though it was small, it had been our sanctuary, a place where I thought I could rebuild what had been lost. Now it felt empty. I didn't know what to do with myself. The silence I had long been living with at my parents' house seemed louder here. Ethan stayed in the living room, packing, while I went to the kitchen to make something, anything, to keep my hands busy. I didn't want to think, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. How had it come to this? How had they pushed me so far into the background? The truth was clear now. They hadn't simply neglected me. They had intentionally erased me. I wasn't just ignored. I had been dismissed as unworthy of even being considered in the grand picture of our family. I could still feel the sting of my mother's words, the way she had laughed along with everyone else when she asked about my wedding. When's yours? It echoed in my mind over and over again. I had spent so many years telling myself that family was about making room for everyone, but it had always been clear who really mattered in that house. Catherine, not me. She had always been the shining star, the one they turned to for everything, the one who could do no wrong. And I had been the shadow, the quiet one who had learned to make herself small enough to fit into whatever space they'd allow. Now that I knew the truth, now that I knew Catherine had stolen my moment, I couldn't unsee it. She had deliberately sabotaged my wedding by making sure I stayed invisible, just so hers could take center stage. The emails, the messages, the invitations, everything had been erased because she wanted no competition. I felt sick just thinking about it. I couldn't even bring myself to talk to Ethan. He didn't need to say it, but I could see the frustration in his eyes. He was angry. Angry at me, angry at them, angry at everything. But mostly, I knew he was angry at himself for not seeing it sooner. We had spent so much of our lives trying to make things work, trying to build something solid together, only to be confronted with the fact that everything had been built on a foundation of lies. My family hadn't just ignored me. They had manipulated me into thinking that this kind of treatment was normal, that it was what love looked like. The worst part, I couldn't even blame them for what they had done. They hadn't been raised to think differently. To them, perfection had always been about keeping up appearances, keeping everything neat and controlled. I had just been one of the things they had to keep under wraps. I didn't know how long I stood there in the kitchen, lost in my thoughts, but Ethan's voice broke through my reverie. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked softly. I shook my head. I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to explain to him why it hurt so badly. I didn't want to tell him how betrayed I felt. He had been a good husband, but he didn't know what it was like to be invisible. He didn't understand the deep ache of being left out of everything that mattered. But he was right about one thing: we couldn't keep living this way. We couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when it was. This had to change. I didn't know what I was going to do next, but I couldn't just let this slide. Not again. I walked into the living room, where Ethan was sitting, hands clenched in his lap. I sat down next to him, and for a long time we just sat in silence. It wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary. "I want to confront them," I finally said, my voice steady but full of emotion. He looked at me, surprise flashing in his eyes. "You're sure about this?" he asked, his voice gentle. I nodded. "I have to. They need to hear it. They need to know that what they've done to me, what they've allowed to happen, isn't okay anymore." Ethan didn't argue. He didn't have to. He knew I was right. The silence had been too much for too long. I wasn't going to let it continue, not anymore. The days leading up to my confrontation with my family felt like an eternity. Each morning, I woke up with the weight of what I had to do pressing down on my chest, but I knew I couldn't keep hiding from the truth anymore. I had spent my entire life trying to fit into their mold, trying to make myself small enough to fit in their perfect world. And now, it was time to stand up and let them see me for who I truly was. Ethan stood by me every step of the way, but I could tell he was conflicted. He didn't want to see me hurt, but he knew this was something I had to do for myself. "You're not doing this for revenge, right?" he asked one evening as we sat on the couch, my hand tightly holding his. "No," I replied, my voice steady but firm. "I'm doing this because I need to stop pretending. I need them to know how much they've hurt me and why I can't keep living in the shadows. It's not about them anymore. It's about me." Ethan didn't answer right away. He just squeezed my hand and nodded, the look in his eyes saying everything he couldn't put into words. The day arrived. Thanksgiving had passed, but the wounds were still fresh. This wasn't going to be a repeat of the dinner where I had spoken the truth for the first time. This was different. This time, I was going to take my place at the table, and I wasn't leaving until I had made myself heard. I wore a simple navy dress. Nothing extravagant, just something that made me feel strong. As I looked in the mirror, I took a deep breath. This was it. I was no longer the quiet one, the invisible one. I was going to let them see me, all of me. The family dinner was being held at my parents' house, and as I pulled into the driveway, I felt a wave of tension wash over me. It wasn't just the nervousness of facing them, it was the finality of it all. This was the end of a chapter I had been trapped in for too long. The silence, the manipulation, the erasure, it all ended here. I stepped inside the house, my heart pounding. The familiar scent of turkey and stuffing filled the air, but it wasn't comforting anymore. It was suffocating. Lily was standing by the fireplace, her husband adjusting her hair, a perfect picture of the life she'd always gotten. I wanted to hate her for what she had done, but I didn't. She wasn't the real villain. She was just a symptom of the problem. My mother was fussing over the table, talking about the wedding like it was the only thing that mattered. My father sat at the head of the table, pouring wine mechanically. It was all the same, everything always revolved around Lily. Even the way they spoke, the way they moved, the way they dismissed me. I felt the familiar sting of being ignored, but this time, I wasn't going to let it slide. This time, I was going to make them see me. I took my seat at the table, directly across from Lily. I set my glass down with a little more force than necessary, and for the first time in years, I didn't look away. The conversation started with the usual empty praise for Lily, but my mother's question came, as I knew it would. "So, Kat," she said brightly, "when's your wedding?" I didn't flinch. I didn't hesitate. I looked straight at her and replied, "I already had mine." The room fell into an eerie silence. For a moment, I thought maybe time had stopped altogether. But then, my father's voice broke through. We never got any invitations. I didn't answer right away. I just reached into my bag, pulled out my phone, and placed it gently on the table. The glow from the screen illuminated my face, and for the first time, I felt something close to triumph. This was the invitation I sent, I said quietly. 4 deliveries, 4 signatures, all marked received by Lily. The gasp from my mother was deafening. My father leaned in, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Lily didn't move. She sat frozen, her hands clenched into fists on her lap. Lily, my father said softly, did you intercept these? Lily didn't answer at first. Her gaze flickered between my phone and her lap. Her silence spoke volumes. It was her. It had always been her. I swiped to the next screenshot, the family email log. My father's face darkened as he looked at the timestamp. You deleted the email, he whispered. I nodded, feeling a wave of clarity wash over me. It wasn't a glitch, Dad. It wasn't forgetfulness. It was deliberate. There was no more pretending, no more deflecting. My mother looked like she was about to cry, but there was no sympathy in me. Not anymore. I had spent my life trying to make them love me, trying to get their attention, and now I was done. I stood up, my legs steady beneath me. I'm done, I said simply. I'm done pretending that this is a family. I'm done begging for a place at the table, and I'm done trying to make you see me when you never wanted to. The room was silent, except for Lily's quiet sobs. She had lost control, and for the first time it wasn't my fault. I grabbed my coat and walked toward the door. My father's voice called after me, but I didn't look back. I had already said everything I needed to. When I stepped outside, the cold air hit me like a breath of fresh air. For the first time in my life, I felt free. I wasn't defined by their neglect anymore. I wasn't invisible anymore. Ethan was waiting for me at the door when I got home. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. He just wrapped his arms around me and held me, letting me cry the tears I had been holding back for years. In that moment, I knew that I had finally found my place, not in their world, but in my own.